With no further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Laura Nelson is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Computational something. It's a fancy institute at Northeastern University. Laura received her PhD from Berkeley in Sociology in 2014. She was then a postdoctoral fellow at the Northwestern Institute for Computational Organization. And she's going to talk about some of the work that started there today. And then she spent a year at BIDS as a junior fellow, and now she's been at Northeastern for a year and a half now. Right? Anyway, please help me welcoming Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a fantastic conference. I'm super thrilled to see how much it's grown over the past 4 years. I was at the first 2 iterations of it, so I'm really happy to be back here. So thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about work I'm doing with Braden King at Northwestern University. We're looking at social movements. So social movements, the definition of social movements is that it's, sorry, I'm going to start a timer. Okay. It's group action oriented toward a collective goal of promoting or halting social change. Simple definition. Within this definition of social movement, there's a lot of complexity, and that's what social movement scholars try to get a handle on. So actions, there's a whole range of actions, of course, lobbying, mass protests, boycotts, social media campaigns, but what about collective gardening? What about art shows? Do those count as actions in a social movement? Of course, the same thing with goals. There's a huge range of goals, policy and legal change, of course, regulations, building new institutions, but what about cultural change? What about discursive change? What about changing individual behavior or practices? Does that count as a social movement? So there's a lot of discussion about what counts as actions and goals within a social movement. But what we're concerned about, what I'm concerned with is also the mission. So social movements have goals. They want to get an institution passed or a policy changed. But really the way people get passionate about social movements, the way they get recruited into them is because there's a larger mission or goal that they feel connected to. And that, I feel, is often missing in the social movements literature. Not always, but in certain ways it's missing. And that's what we're concerned with here, is thinking about the role of mission and action and goals in social movements. So one of the biggest contributors to social movement research is the dynamics of collective action. I love this work. Sarah Sewell has done a lot with it. So they do things like tracking protest activity over time. They have the type of claim being made, the type of action. They can do this quantitative measure of it. It's really fantastic work, and it's really kind of blew up how we understand social movements over time. So they'll do things like dancing and lobbying came together at a certain time period as an innovative way to approach tactics. So they're looking at tactics, they're looking at claims, and they're looking at how tactical repertoires change over time. But again, in here, we're missing mission. So they say, yeah, protest, here's the claim, but what they're not measuring, and it's not a dig on them, they've done a lot of work, but they do miss kind of the overall mission of the organizations that they're tracking and the actions that they're tracking. Other research, like Myra Marks-Ferry, think seriously about mission, and the conclusion about how organizations portray mission is through discourse. Discourse connects a series of actions and claims into a coherent mission. So organizations will participate in a whole series of actions, and then through discourse, the way they explain their position in that, they are putting themselves into a coherent mission. So I want to do this computationally. I think that we can do it computationally on a big scale. So what I'm looking at is trying to map the full ecology of claims made by social movements, the full ecology of tactics, and then seeing if I can identify mission by looking at the discourse connecting these two ecologies over time. Case study is in the environmental movement, largely because it's so diverse. It's got a huge array of actions and goals and missions within the umbrella of the environmental movement, and it's been long-standing. So it's a really good case study to kind of look at the diversity of what's going on in these movements. And Braden and I really wanted to make sure we weren't just looking at the standard social movement organizations or tactics. So we collected data from 527 organizations, or on 527 organizations from 406 different news media sources, because there's known biases in the big national newspapers, which is they all report on the same events. And there's local bias, so people will report on the local events. So we wanted to get as wide of a range of social media, news media sources as we could. So it's around 350,000 articles. And with the goals and tactics, we didn't want to assume a priori we knew what the goals and tactics were. We wanted it to emerge from the data, so we would pick up things like collective gardening as a tactic, which you may not think of as a social movement. My methods are data-driven, inductive, and interpretive, because I don't want to assume I know what's going on in this movement. Computer, human, computer, prime. So if you've talked to me before, you know that's kind of my standard method, which is you start with computers, and I think that's really important. You start with them, the human comes in to interpret, and you end with a computational test of your methods. So I'm going to use topic models, hierarchical clustering, and part of speech tagging, and I'll get more into the details here, but this is more a broad overview of this thing. So the 3 steps that we took. First, can we identify mission through discourse? It was an open question for us. We didn't know if we actually could do it. Then identify actions, and then explore the interactions between mission. The interaction between mission and actions. Well, it's a mouthful. So discursive categories using computational methods. We wanted to turn 350,000 articles, about 527 organizations, into a discursive distance matrix. So if we don't want to assume we know what the missions are, the intuition behind this is that organizations that are close together in a discursive distance are going to have similar missions. Then we can look at those organizations that are close together, we can read their mission statements, and we can try and qualitatively identify what these kind of clusters of missions are. So we did a 200K structural topic model, clustered that into 13-dimensional space. So we did a visual method to do the cutoff for that. I created a distance between organizations if they are correlated over these dimensions. So this is an organization by organization matrix filled in with -1, 0, 1 if they're correlated at the 0.05, not 0.5, sorry, that's a mistake. And then I did a hierarchical cluster of the distance matrix and then interpreted the clusters. So each line here, each row is an organization, and this is then a hierarchical cluster of that distance matrix between organizations. And what we found when we qualitatively interpreted the mission statements was that mission in this data was captured through what we're calling goal orientation. And in this case, it is what level of society is responsible for change. So we have 3 main clusters in the data. The first one sees change coming through institutions. So their mission is, we cannot achieve change unless we change institutions. The other one is individual transformation. The way we achieve change is to stop eating meat, to stop wearing fur, to recycle more. So it's really about individual transformation. And the third one is about community mobilization. We can't change anything unless the community is involved in the local conservation efforts. So it's these 3 broad goal orientations that cluster the organizations in this data. Here are some. I'm almost on purpose don't want you to read these because I don't think that the topics represent any sort of ontological truth. It's a data reduction technique. But here are example organizations from each of these 3 kind of mission clusters. And you can see that there are differences across the topic space. So this is the 13-dimension space. But we're using it more to cluster these organizations. So here are the organizations in there. Second step then is to map actions. So we got mission, now let's map actions. How do we do that? Actions, tactics are actions, so we used a part of speech tagger to pull out all the verbs, and then we qualitatively clustered those tactic words into tactical clusters. And this comes from Gary King's recognition that it's easier to cluster words into dictionaries than it is to come up with words that make up a category. So humans are really good at shuffling words into categories. We're really bad at coming up with words in categories. So that's what we did there. 9 tactical categories. We found the kind of standard, disruptive protest, political, juridical. We found some non-standard tactics, lifestyle and culture, business tactics. So we kind of now have the full ecology of actions in this movement. And so this is the distribution of tactics over these 3 kind of goal orientations. And what we found is that there's not one tactic associated with each goal orientations. The tactics are actually pretty well distributed. So each of these goal orientations use a variety of tactics to reach their goal. So it's not like institutional change, you always use protest. It's fairly well distributed across it. So our third thing is then, how do actions gain meaning? So this means something in one situation, this means something very different depending on where you are. So of course actions are socially and culturally situated and they gain an action meaning through society. So now we're looking at how actions are linked to meanings. That's our third step here. And what we found as we're looking at this is we're looking at like the different tactical clusters across the different goal orientations is that the same tactic can have very different meanings depending on what mission it is attached to. So a protest does not always mean the same thing. It means something different depending on how the protest is aligned with the rest of the actions taken by an organization. And we mapped 3 ways that this happens. So 3 ways that actions gain meaning through this kind of discourse. One is the outcome of the action. The second is the process of change. And the third is change that the organizations believe is meaningful or sustainable change. So I'm going to give very brief examples of these 3 ways that actions are mapped onto meaning here. So outcome of the action. So the tactic here is hunting, which is a surprisingly common tactic in the environmental movement, which surprised me, but I guess maybe other people knew about this more. So the same tactic, hunting, 2 different organizations here, Ducks Unlimited and the National Wild Turkey Federation. So they both think that increasing hunting or hunting is a good tactic to encourage conservation. But the outcome for these 2 organizations is very different. So Ducks Unlimited is in the community mobilization goal orientation, and what they think is that if you are outdoors and you're hunting with your community, with your people, you're more likely than to conserve your local community, your local wildlife area, because you want to hunt and you want to be involved with your community. So the outcome of this action is to get the community mobilized to be involved in the outdoors. The National Wild Turkey Federation is in the individual transformation goal orientation, and they want individuals to hunt because then you're paying hunting licenses, you're paying fees, and those fees goes to conservation. So the outcome of the action here is more money for conservation because more individuals are hunting. So it's the same tactic, different meaning to these 2 organizations. The second way is the process of change. So the tactic here is the boycott, to encourage people to spend money in environmentally conscious ways. So one of the organizations is Sociology, and they encourage rich people to take vacations in what they call eco-lodges, things that are environmentally friendly. The other one is PETA, which has their cruelty-free campaign, where they have a list of organizations, of businesses that are cruelty-free, and they encourage you to buy it. The process of change for these 2 organizations is very different. So Sociology wants island communities to have a way to make money without destroying doing forestry or anything like that. So they think that if the community is able to sustainably use their resources that are at their fingertips to increase their money, just how they live, that's how we can achieve sustainable change. We don't just spend money somewhere, but the community has to be able to responsibly use their resources. PETA, who's in the individual transformation, really just wants you to stop buying cruelty stuff. It's about you making individual choices, and if everybody makes responsible choices, we're going to have change. So it's about the community being involved in making money, individuals leading up to social change. So the process of change for these 2 organizations is different, and the role of the tactic there is different. And then change that is meaningful is the last way. So here we have the Keep America Beautiful campaign. They have a Recycling at Work campaign, so the tactic here is recycling. The other one is the Silicon Valley Toxic Waste Coalition here. And so they're both trying to promote recycling. The Keep America Beautiful organization is in the community mobilization, and they think that it's not enough for individuals to recycle at home. It has to be a community effort. Everywhere you go in the community, you need to see recycling. You need to have the opportunity to recycle. So me recycling my bottles at home is not going to lead to sustainable change. It has to be at the community level in order to achieve that. The Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition is in the institutional change goal orientation, and what they have found is that people in California in particular are recycling their e-waste. The recycling companies don't recycle them. It's awful. Like they throw it in, they dump it in third world countries. They do all these horrible things. So they say it's not enough for individuals to change. We have to change institutions and put pressure on institutions to make sure they're doing what they need to do. So it's the way that change becomes sustainable and meaningful for these organizations and these different mission statements or goal orientations is very different. So the tactic of recycling means something very different in these two situations. So the point here is that organizations from each of these goal orientations use a wide variety of tactics. They're linked together through discourse to lead to this kind of larger mission of institutional change, individual transformation, or community mobilization. So tactics are used widely, but they're used for different purposes here. So what did we learn from this? How do we measure mission in a computational, scalable way? We did find that if we look at the discourse connecting actions to claims, we are able to measure mission. And in our case, mission was defined through a goal orientation, and that is what level of society was responsible for change. But the kind of method of doing this is transferable to any situation where you're looking at organizations, qualitatively interpreting these clusters, and then understanding how the larger sector of organizations understands their mission. There's tactical diversity. So tactics are not organizations use a wide variety of tactics, but context matters. We have to understand how that tactic is being used. It's not just enough to count protests. We need to know which organizations are doing protest at what time and how it connects to their larger kind of ecology. And the same tactic can have very different meanings depending on what goal orientation it's linked to. And that happens through the outcome of the action can be different, the process of change, and how change becomes sustainable. So these three different ways that discourse maps action onto meaning here. Since this is a text analysis symposium, I will just end with some thoughts on text analysis and how text analysis can contribute to this kind of way of understanding organizations. So topic modeling as a data reduction technique. If you know me and you've talked to me, I kind of rail on topic modeling even though I use it in my research. I think that it never represents an ontological truth and it should not be considered as representing an ontological truth, but it can be very helpful as a data reduction technique, as a way to see things in your data. So in our case, we're trying to represent the organizations as a discourse. If you're doing like cosine similarity between text, it's dominated by words like the, a, and that really drives the cosine similarity between organizations. So I don't want to do that. So using topic modeling, you try to pull out the discourse, which is what topic modeling is meant to measure. So by representing organizations on a discursive matrix, not a word matrix, we get much closer at clustering on discourse rather than word choice. Hierarchical clustering on this discursive distance matrix, so turning it into an organization by organization matrix. So we're not clustering on the topics, we're not clustering on the discourse, we're clustering on the distance between organizations. That enables you to see clusters in your data. So instead of just trying to read the mission statements for 527 organizations and figure what the hell is going on in this, I can now say, all right, these are clustered together. I'm going to read those mission statements together, and that can be a much better way of looking for patterns in your data. And then the computer-human-computer prime approach. Hope my Marxist students appreciate that. Starting with the computer, then the human, then the computer. And that's not arbitrary. Put a lot of thought into that, and not everybody agrees with that. Other people think it should be human-computer-human, so I want to defend the computer-human-computer prime. I don't have a replication repository for this yet because we have yet to send it out, but I will. But I do have code up there to replicate a lot of what I did, so I believe in reproducible research. So I try to put my code up there so you can see that code, but I will eventually produce a replication repository to the extent possible under the law. Okay, thank you. Questions? Or?
Thanks for the cool talk. One thing, just technical thing that I didn't quite understand is you talked about the 350,000 newspaper articles,
Yep.
and I wasn't sure how you attach those to particular organizations. Are you like doing named entity recognition and getting text surrounding organization mentions in the news or something?
Yeah, it doesn't need names. So we have the names of the 527 organizations. So if the organization was mentioned in the text and the following 10 sentences, then that document was attached to the organization.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was just, we have the list. We already had the list, and that came from originally. And that's how we got the data in the first place. We did a keyword search based on the names of the organizations and acronyms to get the full. Yeah, so it was already built in.
Okay, so I'm going to take a small role with the human-computer order. I think that the degree to which you want to start with humans depends on the degree to which you have theoretical knowledge a priori. That the human part can end up being more a deductive piece of it because you have something you want to get out of a large amount of data, and then you want to see if there's something that you didn't know, which is why you would use more unsupervised methods later. And then you need to validate the results of those. So there is a point at which a human-computer-human thing works. It depends on the nature of the knowledge that the human has before the investigation of the data begins.
Right, so if you have like a very specific category, you want to say, does this category exist in the data in a deductive way? The same way you would be like hand coding, right? We have a dictionary, and you either hand code it or you train people to hand code it. So in that sense, you're guiding the computer step, but I still think it should be the computer because it's not reproducible if it's the humans doing hand coding.
No, that's why I was saying.
Yeah, so the human is involved in it. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yeah.
Then a human has to
Validate it.
to make sure that when the computers, because keyword searches can often come up with incredibly relevant things, and only human validation will make that actually for, the things we're looking for. The same thing happens when you're trying to classify the words, right?
Yeah, I'm still going to claim that it's the computer needs to be doing that first step. It can definitely be, it doesn't have to be unsupervised. It doesn't have to be inductive. It can be supervised machine learning, of course, requires hand coding in some cases, but I think that we as a community should not be hand coding anything. I just think it's not reliable and it's not reproducible, and we're not quite there yet. We still have to hand code, but the goal should be to move away from that. So in that case, it's still CHC prime, but it's supervised or structured rather than unsupervised in that first step.
Do we need an H prime?
Maybe, yeah.
C double prime?
CH.
I'm just going to keep iterating.
Yeah, just tick it up. Right. Yeah, because the human would validate it, and then it's messy. It's not as clean as that, but I do think the human should not be.
What does top modeling really buy you here? I can see you applying all kinds of methods to get some of the concepts behind the text. Like you could do a word embedding or do class analysis what's unique about
So word embedding, what was the second thing you said?
latent class analysis?
Yeah, latent class analysis would work. Maybe some sort of network, like what Peter Bierman does, word networks. Semantic networks is a little river network that Alex Rule and Peter Bierman do, which is, I think, interesting, and it's built on the same intuition of topic modeling, which is like the co-occurrence of words and documents. So it's a different way of measuring the same thing, which is words that cluster together in documents represent some theme in the data. So I think topic modeling has been validated for that purpose of coming up with themes a lot. The network analysis would work as well, although I'm trying to think of how you turn it into a matrix, like the network analysis, the semantic network into a matrix. So the goal is to represent an organization across a discursive vector, whatever size, 10, 15 size vector. So we need some way to vectorize text across or reduce text to a vector. And topic modeling, that's what it does. That's what it was built to do, is to reduce text into a vector. So in that sense, it is the most straightforward way to do that.
That's also a pretty straightforward application of word embeddings and just add together all the words.
But word embedding is on the full text. It's not on the document level.
You could use Doc2Vec instead of Write2Vec.
You could do Doc2Vec. Doc2Vec may be interesting. That I don't.
Really use Glow, too.
On Doc2Vec.
Or you just add together all the word vectors for a given document, you get an equivalent measure.
That's a huge vector. I mean, yeah. But the topic models is explicitly built for this purpose, right? It's explicitly built to reduce text to a smaller dimensional space. So why not use the tool that is built explicitly for this purpose? Word embedding says something different. It's on the word level. It's not on the thematic level. So I don't think word embeddings would work here. I'm going to come down pretty strong on that. Word embeddings would not work. Networks, maybe, if you could think about how to do networks into a dimensional reduction. But, I mean, this is the closest thing you can get to the mathematical assumptions of topic models. And people use topic models in all sorts of crazy ways, but this is like the definition. So
So I think we're going to have to switch to the next.
yeah.
So
Thank you.
thank you very much.